The winter of 1971 settled heavily over the plains of Champ, a shallow bowl of villages, ridges and scrubland that lay west of the Manawar Tawi river. For decades the region had been a geographical inconvenience, a flat corridor pointing like an arrow towards Akhnoor, the hinge of Jammu's entire defensive line. Indian officers studied the terrain every year in their monsoon briefings, tracing the same contours, the same river bends, the same avenues of approach. Everyone knew that if a major war ever erupted, Pakistan's armor would push through Chamb first, because Chamb offered the shortest and straightest path to slicing off India's communication with the Kashmir Valley. The problem was simple, mathematical even. Whoever controlled Chamb controlled the door to the north. When December came, the war formally announced itself through sporadic artillery exchanges that lit up the horizon at dusk. The Indian units of 10th Infantry Division scattered between defensive positions, irrigation embankments and small forward posts. They felt the shift in atmosphere long before the official orders arrived. The Pakistanis were concentrating forces with an efficiency that left no room for misinterpretation. Columns of Patton tanks were moving at night, infantry brigades tightening into assault formations. Indian patrols reported heavier engine sounds across the lines, consistent with tracked movement and muffled thud of bridging equipment being assembled. The valley seemed to thrum with a low, metallic heartbeat. On the night of 3rd and 4th December, the attack began with an artillery barrage so disciplined it looked like choreographed. Shells walked across the Indian front line trenches, then reversed direction, then struck communication nodes. Telephone lines snapped, company headquarters were shaken out of position, and the dust clouds rolled over the landscape like advancing weather fronts. In the chaos, Pakistani armor surged forward. Their opening thrust, executed with speed rather than finesse, relied on shock, overwhelmed the Indian positions before they reorganized. Indian anti-tank teams engaged as best as they could, but the Pakistani regiments moved with compact discipline by bypassing strong points and forcing India to either withdraw or expose themselves to flanking fire. By midday of the first day, Indian commanders realized the scale of the attack was larger than anticipated. Champ was no longer a probing action, it was deliberate sector offensive. Pakistani units were pressing towards Mandiala, north and south, key pivots in the defensive layout. Indian armor counterattacked, but the ground, crisscrossed with irrigation channels, nalas, and marsh patches, favored hull-down positions for the defenders, and Pakistan's tanks exploited this ruthlessly. Several Indian tanks bogged down, their their treads sinking into unseen marches, becoming stationary stilettos against an approaching enemy. Through the next 48 hours a pattern emerged. Pakistani assault was not a blind charge, it was a multi-layered grind. Armor-led mechanized infantry consolidated, artillery shaped the battlefield, and engineers cleared obstacles. India fought stubbornly, platoon by platoon, often isolated because communications lagged behind the pace of the assault. Brigade headquarters attempted to realign units, but the enemy had already disrupted the geometry of defense. Pakistani forces brought the fight to Mandiala Crossing, a critical point near the river, forcing Indian units to defend under continuous tank fire and observation. The river that had been assumed to be a natural barrier became an avenue of exploitation. Pakistani assault groups pushed towards the Manawar Tawi in coordinated waves. Indian commanders ordered controlled withdrawals, not because the troops lacked resolve, but because the lines were being bent to breaking point. Several Indian companies were nearly encircled before they pulled out at night under cover of smoke. The retreat was not chaotic but strained, a battlefield calculus of trading space for survival. Burning tanks, Indian and Pakistani, lit the landscape as twisted metal and black smoke contoured the sky. By December the 7th, the Pakistanis achieved what their operational plan had demanded: the capture of Champ Town and the withdrawal of Indian forces to the east of Manawar Tawi. It was the first major territorial gain on the Western Front in the war. and for Pakistan a strategic and psychological victory. The Indian units regrouped along new defensive lines, determined not to allow the enemy to push forward towards Akhnur. The fight shifted from offensive thrust to positional containment. Pakistan had reached the limits of its design. India had stabilized its defenses. The wars elsewhere in the east was reaching in decisive climax, and the Chamb operation settled into consolidation rather than further exploitation. But for the soldiers who fought there, the story was not measured in divisions, rivers, or strategic maps. It was grinding weight of attrition. The constant roar of tank engines, the way the ground trembled as armor advanced, the assault groups moving through dust thick enough to taste. Forward posts overrun at dawn, radio operators calling commanders into static field lines, anti-tank gunners firing until their barrels overheat, infantrymen crawling between irrigation ditches as machine gun tracers sliced the air around them, medics dragging wounded men across collapsing trenches, officers reading situation reports that were outdated by the time they arrived. Every day the battlefield reshaped itself. A tree blown apart becomes a landmark. A smoldering tank becomes cover. A vacated trench becomes death trap for whoever assumes it is still secure. By the end of the sector battle, neither side reassembled the formations that had entered the fight. Units were exhausted, leaders were changed by what they had witnessed. The plains of Champ, deceptively simple in appearance, had drawn blood in direct proportion to the tactical value they offered. Pakistan held the ground, India denied them further advance. History recorded Chamb as one of the sharpest, fastest, and most tactical, coherent operations of the 1971 Western Front. Yet underneath the strategic language lay an unvarnished truth. Champ was a test of speed, nerve, and endurance. It punished hesitation and rewarded aggression, reshaping the front faster than either side had anticipated. Even after the ceasefire, the landscape bore the evidence of how the battle was unfolded. Burnt out hulls dotted the fields. Trenches remained carved into the soil like surgical incisions. Bulldozers scraped away debris, but the ground remembered. Veterans from both sides later described Cham as a place where time compressed. Hours felt like minutes in the midst of fighting. But years later, the memories stretched endlessly. The sector that had always been a rhetorical vulnerability had become a real one, paid for in metal and blood. Champ ended not in a dramatic triumph, but in a cold equilibrium. Pakistan took what it aimed for. India ensured the loss didn't meta metastasize into strategic collapse. The war's larger narrative, shaped overwhelmingly by events in the East, overshadowed the ferocity of what occurred in these few square kilometers of contested lands. But for analysts, commanders, and the soldiers who survived it, Champ remained a study in operational execution, battlefield adaptation under extreme pressure. It was not just a battle over territory, it was a demonstration of what happens when planning, aggression, and terrain align into a single brutal equation.